Hi, everyone. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, for this episode of the Agronomists. Joining me tonight, before I bring in my guests, joining me tonight are two very fun people that it's their first time on the show. So I'm very excited. Hola to Warren Schneckenberger. I guess we're feeling our oats out there in Eastern Ontario. I did want a tip of the hat, of course, last week. We had Dan Pecker and Dave Hooker, and we talked all about red clover, and of course, that completely alienated the West. So here we are, bringing it on home. We've got a whole episode for our Westerners because, yes, we know that Eastern Canada stores grain, but frankly, it's just a much bigger undertaking in the West. So tonight, that is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about grain storage. We're going to talk about conditioning grain. We'll talk a little bit about grain drying, I'm sure. But yes, so before we get started, though, of course, I do want to remind everybody that you can qualify for CEU credits if that's your jam. Just head over tomorrow to realagriculture.com/agronomists and let us know you watched the episode. Also, Kara has already noticed that on a scale of 1 to humid, how humid is it? And yes, it is incredibly humid and hot and sweaty and sticky here in Ontario. Unlike the West, of course, that parts of it got some rain for the last couple days. And I'm sure I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But yes, thanks, Kara. If you could send fans, that'd be great. Okay, I'm going to bring in my guests, one from Manitoba, one from Saskatchewan. So look at that. I'm sure there'll be some CFL banter happening shortly. But joining me now, we'll have Shawn Senko with the Canola Council of Canada and Lorne Grieger with PAMI. Did I say it right, Lorne?
You did. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Well
I
done.
tried. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So mostly that was my apology for you're in Portage-la-Prairie right now.
That is
So
correct.
sorry. Yeah. Sorry about your luck. And Shawn joining us from Saskatoon, right, Shawn? There and abouts. All right. Okay. So because it is both of your first time on the Agronomist, Shawn, I'll start with you. Quick introduction, who you are, of course, with the Canola Council. Do you have a specialty with the Canola Council?
Yeah, a few harvest management and weeds are my two specialties. So,
Okay. And what is your favorite stage of canola to scout?
oh boy, that's I guess just after seeding that's when you see what you've done. So,
Yeah. Okay. No one's gonna say like full potting. Anyway, you can't walk through it. Okay. And Lorne, of course, with PAMI in Portage Prairie, but tell our audience a little bit about yourself as well.
Sounds good. Thanks, Lyndsey. Lorne Grieger. I'm an agricultural engineer. Have worked with PAMI almost 19 years in various parts of the business, doing ag research, a lot in the harvest and grain storage portion of the research that we have done at PAMI, and now doing some of the extension work on the grain storage side on behalf of the organization.
Okay, and that, of course, brings us to today's topic and to tonight's topic. Obviously, a kind of a bizarre year already. It's been incredibly difficult for many producers. We'll get into a bit about, conditioning grain and these sorts of things. But Shawn, just to catch us up, of course, you work in the Saskatoon area. So harvest, of course, has started there for some of the earlier crops. How are things looking there right now?
well, harvest-wise, it started out really as far as storage goes. I thought there's going to be no storage talk at all. I farm as well, an hour east, and got through some of the cereals, wheat, and it was dead dry. We had no rain for the longest time, and then last week things just completely flipped around here now. So we are getting rain now, so I'm expecting probably some tougher grain coming off, and because of the severe drought, probably some second growth in the grains as well. So we've gone from very boring storage year to maybe a bit more of an interesting one. Not in a good way though.
Okay. Well, is interesting ever good? That's one of those one of those words that sometimes I wonder, can it be good, interesting? All right, and Lorne, of course, you are in Manitoba.
That's right.
I did mention, some rain has
Some
fallen in
rain.
certain areas. Yeah, so catch us up on what things are like there.
Yeah, no, most of the cereals are off and canola is down right now. And it's interesting when you look at the years, and hopefully storage is a very boring subject. We don't want to have any surprises. We want this to be just a real part of the routine of every day, every harvest season. Taking me back a little bit to 2019, where it was quite dry in 2019, getting into canola close to Labor Day weekend, and then it started to rain and didn't really stop raining in 2019, and storage became more of a topic. So up to this point, we haven't been talking about this, but it's one of those things that as the weather changes and there's opportunity to see some changes in managing the crop, that's when the conversations start again, and being ready to answer questions on your own and making sure you're prepared for any seasonal variation that can come, even in a year that hasn't had a lot of rain up until this point.
Now, and that's just it. We did have, of course, excessively dry conditions in some areas, but to a dry bias in many. One of the things that I've seen coming in, and I don't know if either of you can comment on this, but seeing a lot of crickets and or grasshoppers in the grain in the combine hopper. Are those going to cause an issue in the bin? Shawn, I'll start with you. If I have a lot of them.
Yeah, there's definitely it's patchy. There's areas with definitely hoppers, and yeah, I've heard a large number of crickets. So you know, a large amount can cause a problem in the bin. They're definitely not good for storage.
And what would you say is the best way to get rid of them? Because I have ideas, but I don't think any of them actually work.
Oh, that's I mean, it typically the number isn't large enough to be that much of an issue. I mean, I I have seen them cleaned out in really bad years with something like a scalper, you know, like a quick cleaning system before you store it. But I don't know if there's. I mean, it's early here yet. I haven't heard of any samples getting that bad to that point yet. But you know, I may just not have heard of them.
Lauren?
Don't have anything else to add from what Shawn has said. You hope there isn't that many in the bin that would cause an issue. But again, those are something to wait and see here, and making sure it's a reasonably clean sample whenever possible.
I'll tell you that my solution is just calling it extra protein and just rolling it in. So just go with it. Right? That's right. I mean, people want us to switch away from meat. They're high protein. Let's just do it. So we just need the marketing for it. So if somebody could solve that problem, I think everything will be fine. Okay, so that's what we're going to work on. All right, I do want to start with, and I do want to start with a clip relatively early in the program. The two of you are new here, but I'll have you know I have a hard time getting to the clips. I tend to talk too much and we get off on tangents, and then it's the journey to the next clip. But producer Jay, I do want to sort of set things up because I want to actually start this conversation and making sure our bins are ready. And then, of course, that conversation of, yes, bringing in either hot grain or, of course, when we get into tough grain. So this is a clip with Angela Brackenreed, your coworker, Shawn, on starting with clean bins and sort of those initial considerations of storing canola, especially.
Yeah, so there's kind of the basics of canola storage that I think we've all heard over and over again, but it's a good reminder of, first of all, for preparing bins, we don't want to be putting canola into bins that have had any malathion in this season. So just a reminder there. Also, once we get canola into those bins, I don't know that there's a lot really in bins across the prairies yet, but once they're in there, we want to be conditioning it immediately. Canola has the tendency to have a pretty high respiration rate for 3 to 6 weeks after binning. And we want to condition it down to somewhere around 8% moisture content, ideally less than 15 degrees Celsius for long-term storage.
And what are you guys recommending as far as supplemental heat? Like what sorts of things are producers asking?
Yeah, so those are the basics of storage that make it sound like this is pretty simple. But then there's all of the in-between, all of the kind of gray areas and unknowns that really make canola storage not that straightforward. So like you mentioned, we're a little bit later starting with canola harvest, particularly in Manitoba, than we're used to. We don't have great conditions for natural air drying with just our fans. So supplemental heat becomes a great tool to kind of extend our good drying days or create good drying conditions if we don't have them naturally. So that's when I'm talking about supplemental heat, I'm talking about just adding a fairly low temperature heat source to our aeration fans or natural air drying fans. So a couple kind of general rules of thumb with supplemental heat is we don't want to add really any more than 10 to 20 degrees Celsius. And we, at the inlet, we don't want the temperature to be much more than 30 degrees Celsius. And the reason for that is we're dealing with pretty low airflow rates with our NAD fans or aeration fans. And if we're adding more heat than that, we run the risk of potentially like physically inducing heating of the canola at the inlet, but also just massively over drying the bottom of the bin and not really reaching the upper layers of that bin. So also to think about is, do you have adequate airflow when we're adding supplemental heat? I mean, that's important with our NAD fans as well, but becomes even more important when we're adding heat. So we want to see at least 1 cubic foot per minute per bushel, CFM per bushel. And I mean, there'd be no harm in being higher than that, but at least be at 1. So the general rules, 1 CFM per bushel, not much more than 30 degrees at that inlet, and should be trying to turn those bins ideally every 3 days if we're adding heat. And then of course, like usual, just monitoring those bins.
I was taking notes and also noticed Angela's cat. So we were talking earlier about pets bombing in videos, and I didn't notice when I previewed that clip, but Angela's cat joining it. Okay, so fantastic. I love it. It's pretty great. Okay, so this, of course, sets us up sort of for this discussion. So, Shawn, I do want to start with you on the clean bin topic, just as that reminder. We need it every year just to make sure that anything that is going to have canola gets cleaned out and you know the history on that bin, correct?
Yes, yeah, and the key point is, I mean, we don't see a lot used anymore, but we definitely don't want malathion on any of the bins. It's just an export issue, so we don't. We got to make sure we know the history. We haven't got anything in those bins.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about just like tidiness in general? And I know we all love cleaning bins, but how important is it to start with a tidy bin?
I mean, there's a lot of reasons for it. One, you just don't want any extra foreign matter in their dockage. Usually the stuff left around the edges and that can be higher moisture as well. So that's going to be a starting point for any spoilage, possibly from that. So, getting rid of that is key. And not a lot of pests that actually bother canola, but you definitely don't want to be starting with anything in the bin if you can help it. So, making sure that's free of that as well. So just getting it that good start.
Mm-hmm. All right. And so one of the points that Angela makes, of course, is that a crop once put in the bin, and with canola, she uses the example that it will respire for several weeks after it's put in that bin. Lorne, if you're comfortable with this, I mean, that's canola, but every crop obviously has this sort of window of time, right, before it acclimatizes in that bin. So how important is it to sort of know what you're putting in the bin and being able to manage it from that point on?
That's an excellent question, Lyndsey. I think that's one of the things that I try and always talk to is making sure you have a plan, understanding what the condition of your grain is so that you can effectively manage it once it's in the bin. It's always a key to get it down to the moisture content you're looking for, but also it's a combination of temperature as well in addition to that moisture. So those are the two keys for long-term safe storage: dry plus cool. Less than 15 degrees Celsius is always that target for grains, making sure that you've gotten a consistent airflow through that bin in order to cool down that grain mass to make sure it's less than 15 degrees for long term. Especially important with canola because of the respiration that it does, and making sure that you can condition that through an aeration at the very least to cool off the grain, but if it's tough, then to also take out some moisture in addition to having it cool at the end of the entire process. So Understanding that's very important, though, and knowing what you have to do in order to make sure that you get to that end point in safe storage condition.
Mm-hmm. Now, Shawn, when, Angela also mentions, of course, turning that bin. So this is natural air drying, but this is with supplemental heat, which we're going to get into quite a bit more in a bit. But the importance of turning that bin, should you be turning the bin even if you're just using natural air drying with canola? And if so, how often?
It depends a bit on the size of the bin, but the rationale behind it is it dries from the bottom, right? So you're gonna have really dry grain on the bottom, and it's gonna be kind of gradient going up. So you don't want to have 5-6% moisture canola on the bottom and 10 on the top when you're done. So every few days is kind of the rule of thumb with most bins to turn it to kind of get that mixture back up and dry it evenly.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned, of course, out your way that it was quite dry, but conditions have shifted slightly to wetter, maybe some re-wetting. So how do you suggest that farmers sort of handle that that situation when putting canola in the bin?
Well, you definitely monitoring what's coming off. But we've gone from probably would have been overly dry grain now to usually the biggest danger is coming out of weather like this. You keep trying, I'm a day too early, and suddenly you've got something on the truck that is 13, 14, and it's got to go somewhere. So you dump that in the bin, and then you get going the next day, and maybe it's closer to 10. But canola's got those pockets, and you got to be really careful when you get that tough grain in there, because it just takes a starting point to cause you problems. So if you do have something like that, get it in the bin, get the air on it, get it, if you got something with heat, get it drying. But then also you'll have to turn it as well if you've got any large differences when it's going into the bin between moisture.
Okay. So, Lorne, I do want to talk a little bit now about, first of all, anyone who sees NAD, and Angela says it, NAD, natural air drying. I was glad that someone reminded me what it was, because I had no idea. Yeah. So, but let's talk a little bit about that supplemental heat, because Lorne, of course, this is something that you've done lots of work on. There's always this question of, okay, if air isn't enough, but we're not putting it through a grain dryer, the supplemental heat is the somewhere in between. So
That's right.
But obviously we need to be safe in doing this. So what
Correct.
do we know about that?
Well, I guess there's a couple things to always consider. One, first of all, being that the temperature is what drives the moisture from inside the kernel to the outside, and your airflow extracts that moisture now that you've removed from the kernel out of your grain mass. So it's that combination of heat to extract the moisture, but also the airflow in order to get it out of your bin. That's making sure that you have airflow is really key, and Angela touched on that with that 1 cubic foot per minute per bushel airflow rate. First step is always understanding your system, knowing what your airflow rate is, and for the volume of grain that you have. Err on the side of caution and make sure that you have enough airflow rate to have that kind of a consistent airflow through that grain mass. It may mean not filling the bin up fully. Those are a couple things that we found with some of the research work that we've done, looking at some of the low-speed centrifugal fans and large bin sizes, that you may stall your fan out if you're overfilling it. So first step is understanding your system, what you can accomplish with natural air drying in itself. The second part to the natural air drying equation is, now I know what my fan is, how much airflow I have, what are good conditions for drying without having to add heat. And that's where you get into the equilibrium moisture content, your EMC charts, as we affectionately call them in the engineering side. Everybody loves EMC, right?
Everyone,
that's right. No, so one of the important
no.
things is understanding that combination of temperature and relative humidity, and what would that, if you blew that consistent air through the grain, what would that bring the grain down to in terms of moisture content? And if it's not the right combination, then you have to adjust that incoming air. The simplest way to do that for bin systems is adding heat. So that's where we call the supplemental heating. It's a little bit of heat, it's not too much, but it can be enough to turn, say, a cool fall day into a good summer day. And that's the thought process and the theory behind it. By adding 10 degrees Celsius air, I've cut my relative humidity in half. So there's that relationship. By adding heat, I've reduced my humidity in my air so I can extract moisture from the grain inside that bin. So those are a couple of the keys that are really important to make sure that you have squared away and have a system ready to go in the event that you get into some of those maybe tougher conditions of grain in a bin, and be able to handle it when it comes off the field.
See, this is a fantastic explanation, because I'll be honest, and I'm going to play the clip with Joy Agnew in a little while, where she talks about, is air dryer at night. Yeah, and talking about, the big cup and the little cup and the what, and we are gonna watch it because it is good. But Shawn, my brain doesn't always work this way. And when we're talking about relative humidity, and then we're talking about, cooler air temps and warmer air temps, and then we add heat. I mean, how do we simplify this in the case of wanting to make sure that we're obviously doing a good job getting that bin to a safe temperature and moisture, but being clear in what needs to happen so that we're not over drying grain or cooking it or those sorts of things. How do we broach what can be quite complicated?
Oh, that's I think Lorne mentioned the charts are a good starting point. Knowing what temperature and moisture or humidity of air has got the capability of drying, and just knowing what that's going to be doing to that grain in the bin. So that'll help determine how fast you have to turn that bin. So if it's got a large capacity to dry, that grain on the bottom of the bin is going to dry really fast. You're probably going to want to be turning that bin sooner than you would if you've had a little not quite as good a drying days. You won't tend to see that bottom base dry out as fast. So that's about the best I can do for trying to explain it, I guess.
This is why we have people who devote their whole career to figuring this stuff out, because it's really complicated, and realistically, it also often is happening at a time where the monitoring, and I don't want to call it babysitting because it's a really important job, but the monitoring happens long after harvest, right? And the work that goes into getting that crop safe to store continues for quite a few weeks. I mean, it is a bit of a marathon, and especially in maybe in a better production year than we're having this year out west, there's a lot of crop to care about. So I mean, it is a pretty complicated undertaking to make sure you've got all those bins where they need to be. We will talk maybe a bit about bin monitoring and some of the technology that's out there, but it certainly does help. But because we are on this topic of equilibrium and stuff, we're going to go to this. We're going to go to this clip of with Joy Agnew, because she was busting some myths, and Lorne, you're probably very familiar with some of these. And one of them that so is air drier at night? And so this brings up the question: if you're just using air drying, do you leave your fans on, or do you turn them off? So we're going to answer some of those questions after, but let's watch this clip with Joy Agnew first.
Is air at night drier than air during the day?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about that. Yeah, a lot of different opinions about that. Yeah.
So in my presentation, I show that if you look at the physics behind it, and you look at air's capacity to hold moisture and how much water it's currently holding, it is in fact true that air at night is drier than air during the day, because it's physically holding less water, less grams of water. And that's completely against kind of the general feeling about it, because at night, the air feels clammy and, the dew is falling, and it just doesn't seem like air at night is drier, but it physically is. It's just that it's closer to saturation, and that's why it feels clammy, but it also, the saturation level is a lot smaller than during the day, so there's just physically less water in the air at night.
So what that means is that the water is drier, but it's holding as much. The air is drier, but it's holding as much water as it can almost.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. But when it comes to drying grain, you're more concerned or interested in how much more water the air can hold before it becomes saturated.
Okay.
Because that's what's happening when you blow air through grain to dry it. Is the grain is essentially pulling or absorbing water out of the grain and then taking it to the top of the bin. So it has to have capacity to hold that moisture. And
that's why they call it relative humidity, right? Relative to the amount of moisture it can hold.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So when you look at it from that perspective, I guess, then air during the day has a higher capacity to dry because it can physically hold more water before it becomes saturated. So that's sort of the confusion around that night versus day, is that the air at night is drier, but the air during the day has greater capacity to dry.
You gave a really good example earlier when you talked about glasses and how much water could be in a glass compared to how much water the glass should be able to hold. You want to just talk a little bit about what you said there?
My water glass analogy is basically showing that, air during the day can hold more water, so it's a big glass. Air at night is a smaller glass. And relative humidity is essentially percentage of full. So air during the day is a big glass. If it's a 50% humidity day, it's half full. So that means there's still that much more headspace to take up moisture. I also use the water glass analogy to illustrate how grain temperature affects the air's capacity to dry. Because as soon as the air passes through grain, if the grain is a different temperature, the air temperature is going to change, and it might change its capacity to hold moisture depending on whether it cools or warms. So warm air, let's say a big glass that's half full, if you pass that through cool grain, that air is going to cool off. And so the glass is going to shrink, but the water that was already in the glass has to go somewhere. And depending on how much water was in the glass and how small the glass shrinks, that water might actually spill over the edge.
So in other words, if you're putting warm air into a cold bin where the grain is actually cold, what can happen is that the moisture can come out of the air.
Exactly.
Even though it's, when it actually feels like it should be drier.
Right.
So then you can actually put moisture in the grain, and part of the problem there is that it's not mixed throughout the entire.
Exactly.
So you can create problems.
Theoretically, yes.
Yeah.
Luckily, though, that is a short-lived phenomenon, because that really depends on the grain being cool to cool it down. As soon as you pass warm air through grain for a certain period of time, it's going to warm up, and then you have, big glass half full again. So it's all right. But I guess that illustration I see a lot of eyebrows raised at that, saying, oh, maybe I should not only run my fan for a couple hours at a time when the grain is cool, because that's what's happening immediately after turning on the fan.
I will tell you, and Shawn, I don't know if you've seen that clip before, and Lauren, I'm sure that this is stuff that you work at every day, but the more I watch that, the more it makes sense. So that's what we're here to do, is that. So this discussion or this idea of, okay, so warm air, of course, has the capacity to hold more water. And this is what we want, right? We want that air to cool the bin, but also to move any excess moisture out of the bin. So that's what we want. Then this brings up the question. If you turn your fans on, do you just leave them on till it's done? Or do you turn them on when conditions are going to dry that grain? This is I feel like this is the age-old question. So, Lauren, I'll start with you. Shawn, you have time to prepare your answer based on what Lauren says.
And it depends, actually, a little bit on what you're trying to accomplish. So it's unfortunately not as straightforward of a question as everybody hopes. There are a couple things that have to factor in. Where are you in terms of your grain condition? If canola, if it's respirant, you want to get your fan on. You want to extract that additional moisture that's coming off the canola seed itself. How long of a duration is the period where the conditions aren't ideal? If it's a couple hours, then most likely it's best to leave your fan on because of the value that you gain by having the airflow through the grain and condition it as well. If it's an extended period of time, though, probably time to turn the fans off if it's not ideal, because you actually may be going backwards in what you're trying to accomplish. So one of the things that I always stress is making sure you understand what you're trying to accomplish with your fan strategy first, and then start making some of those decisions based on the factors that go in your ambient conditions. Where are you in terms of your conditioning inside the bin? If you're trying to dry or just cool, and some of those kinds of factors that go with it. But definitely that the combination of warm air and the ability to extract moisture, it's a key concept that goes with grain storage in bin.
All right, and Shawn, would you like to see growers turn those fans on? Would you like to see them run them longer, or how do you make that call of, no, I'm going to turn it off tonight or whatever because we're close but not there? I mean, what factors in there?
Like Lauren mentioned, we'd like to see them stay on if possible. It's just stalling the drying is never a good thing. You can also have a moisture front kind of moving through the bin, and depending how long you leave it off for, you could actually have something start to happen in that. It can even stall the air from going through when you restart, depending on how wet that grain actually is when you're moving that moisture through. And for small events, I'd say just keep it running. You're not going to go backwards too much for those small periods, but if the weather turns really bad for a longer period of time, you really have to look at that, that charts again. When you're adding supplemental heat, even if it is cooler, but as Lauren mentioned, you raise the air 10 degrees, and you drop the humidity in half. Maybe you're back to decent drying conditions, even under, poorer conditions. So you just have to know what you're putting in the bin, and if you're still able to dry, then keep those fans going.
Which actually brings us to Jason's question. He's in Manitoba, and says, is there a maximum % moisture by different crop type that you can just put in the bin and dry with just air, or when you need to fire up that supplemental heat or the dryer? So is there, Lorne, a relatively handy chart that will give you sort of crop type by moisture that probably just needs cooled?
Yeah, that's a good question. Not that I'm aware of, actually. So there's unfortunately maybe not quite an easy of an answer. It depends a little bit too in terms of capacity and how much time you have to spoilage. Again, the sooner you can get to those dry conditions, the better. That's the less risky approach to going through the process, and that's where understanding what your capacity is for your bin systems relative to when you need to get that dry in front through the grain. Compared to what other options that you have. So,
well, and there's moisture, but then also temperature, right? So if you're putting hot, right? So if you're like these past hot weeks that we've had, you still have to get that, even if it's a safe moisture, you still need to get the temperature down.
That's correct. The first step, though, is to get it dry. So you want to, if you're not dry your grain down and then cool it as that second step. So that's the first thing, is to make sure you can get that process done, get the grain dry, then cool it off for longer term storage.
Okay. And Shawn, what's the rule of thumb for canola?
Well, for, just short-term storage, 10% moisture is fine. If you're going to be moving it, you've got contracts, or in a year like this, there's definitely not going to be, an abundance. So I don't think there'd be trouble moving canola. If you're moving in the next few weeks, 10 moisture is fine. But anything longer term, 8% moisture and under 15. And I usually say the colder the better. If I'm storing canola over winter, I'm turning those fans on in a really cold night and bringing it right down cold. I don't, as far as I know, you can't get too cold.
So, okay, but that brings up my next question then. You can freeze grain, of course, right? I mean, it freezes. What do you have to worry about in that reverse process, potentially, of when those bins start to warm up in the spring? Is there a chance of spoilage happening when things start to warm up in the spring?
You referring to me? Sorry, Lyndsey? Or?
Yeah. Well, I just, we always see those very nasty Twitter pictures of like bins that don't have snow on the top, or right, or something got away on them, and then as things warm up, things get bad. So
yeah, no, it's usually, grain's got a great insulation. That core of that bin will stay cold for a very long time, but you can have those edges of the bin just from the sun will start to warm up. So you still do have to monitor it. Especially if you've got we've got those snowstorms, some will blow in the cap, or some will blow in from under the roof. And you get those warm temperatures, maybe runs down the side and the edge of the bin warms up. So yes, definitely, even though it was cold and it's been stored cold, you can have problems. So you have to monitor it. I mean, that typically it'll be right into May, June. If it's cold, the majority of the bin will stay cold. But there's always those cases where you can see something else going on. So you have to be monitoring it.
Yeah, I just echo what Shawn's saying there. Some of the work that PAMI did with the Canola Council was trying to make that decision. What's best in springtime? Do you leave your bin just naturally warm up? Do you turn it? What's the best way? What we found was just leaving the bin and letting it warm up naturally is the best way to least risk warm the grain up in springtime. But make sure you're monitoring. That's one of the keys for any of the things that you're doing, is monitor and take away the risk by making sure you understand what's happening inside the bin, because you can't always see. There can be pockets. Some of those details become very important.
Absolutely. And so on that topic, of course, there are some very low tech ways to monitor, all the way up to very high tech and getting alerts on your phone, and you can, do all these things remotely. So Shawn, what would you say are, some of the best rules of thumb for monitoring? I mean, should everyone be investing in temperature moisture cables? Is it better off to take, a truckload out and do it that way? What's a decent rule of thumb for monitoring?
Well, I guess all those systems work. It's just the amount of work involved in each one, right? With temperature cables, it's a bit less, but I still say even with cables that you may need to check that bin, or at least make sure the cables are working well and are secured properly. I've heard stories of where the cable wasn't properly secured to the bottom of the bin. They filled the bin and the cable got pushed to the side, and everything looked great till they went to unload the bin and there were hot spots in there. So no matter what you're doing, it's still monitoring, making sure that what's in there is in there. So if you've got a cable system, just make sure it's working properly and it's got the right amount of cables for the bin size. So you're monitoring that entire bin. And if you don't, making sure, depending what that grain goes in at, I always like to see the bin turn no matter what after harvest, just because there's green patches out there, or you've gone through a weedy slough, or like I said, you've tried one day and it was too tough, and that went into the truck. So I like to see canola at least moved once in the fall to make sure it's been mixed and safe.
Okay. Lorne, does PAMI do any? Have you done any work on monitoring in different systems?
We've done some work in that area. One of the keys, just want to make sure that people are monitoring. How you do it, it depends on your risk level and what you want to invest in. When you look at the cost relative to the information you gain, a cable is a pretty good investment when you look at the cost to a peace of mind that comes from that kind of a process. And they aren't perfect, though. The larger the bin, the more cables you need in order to monitor that. But there are other systems out there as well. But regardless of how you're doing it, make sure you're monitoring and understanding what's going on inside that bin throughout the season.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Shawn, you mentioned, letting things warm up and May and June and these sorts of things. And I just think, is anyone going to have any canola left in the bin in May or June this year? Do we think? I don't know. It'll be worth, I can't even imagine what it'll be worth. You'll be putting 6 padlocks on that thing. Yeah, for sure. Anyway, it's going to be an interesting year. That's for sure. Okay. I want to touch back to the supplemental heat thing again. Lorne, you've got some really handy, PAMI does have a really great info sheet that covers a lot of the questions. But one of the things I think that one of the pitfalls that can happen, of course, is too high a temp at the fan and what happens. So walk us through why sort of, if 10 degrees is good, well, 20 must be better, and hey, 30 is great.
Why not?
So how do we decide, and why is that sometimes a bad idea?
Well, one of the things you have to be concerned about is how long. It's not just the temperature, but it's the duration of the temperature and the impact that you can have on grain quality. And therefore, that's the combination that you want to make sure. We know at lower temperatures, your impact on grain quality is reducing the risk of that through that process. And that's where the recommendations are typically on that 20 degrees type of event. We have been involved in the study with the commodities in Alberta, monitoring producers with their bins. And some producers are adding more heat to that bin. One of the questions we haven't answered, though, is what is the impact on grain quality? So that's where you want to be careful. It's just that combination of temperature and the time. So I'm not sure if it's on the screen, Lyndsey, or
which page would you like? We can bring up whichever one you want.
There's a couple. I think I would start with the last page that has a lot of questions. So it goes through some of those.
There we go.
Yeah, yep. In the bottom of the page you're looking at, and those are some of the recommendations. We're trying to limit the airflow rates or limit the temperature increase, again, for safety for the grain inside the bin, maintaining quality. There's a lot of questions that we've gotten and get consistently in fall time. So that's where we've developed this fact sheet, is looking at making sure that producers have the best information they can to answer the questions on that side of things. So 30 degrees is kind of the max that we recommend, just because they don't have additional information at this point to say, yeah, you can go to 35 or 40 or 50, whatever it may be. But again, it's that combination of temperature and how long the grain is at that temperature that you really want to be concerned about for that. And that's where you can get away with a heated air drying or hot air dryer. You can go at it, use a higher temperature because it's not in that temperature range as long. So that's the advantage to hot air dryers, is that short duration of the high temperature and extracts the moisture really quickly.
So, but that of course brings up a whole other set of management options.
That's another management question,
right?
another options. And that's
right.
where the grain drying conversation, especially at this time of year, is making sure you have a plan. If we get into September, what am I going to do if the fall turns into that cool kind of fall, and being prepared and going down that list. If this happens, I'm going to do this. If we get into a real tough condition, then I'm going to get into a heated air drying system so that I know I can get that grain off, get it dried down, and then cool it off later on in the fall when you get to that type of a process.
And I mean, Lorne, you might have a sense of this too, but Shawn, I'll ask you, in your region and in the area that you're working in, are grain dryers increasing in frequency on the farms that you visit and work with?
I'd say it's been especially there were some bad years the last few, so there were definitely some new grain dryers going up on farm, but also a lot of supplemental heaters have gone. A lot of companies have started up in the last few years, and the technology has come quite a long ways. I've seen even with just the supplemental heaters to help this along. It used to be you simply had to turn them on and off by hand. Then you could just set the temperature one thing, and now it's to the point where even with supplemental heat, you can say I want this relative humidity, and the heater will kick in and out, just to hold that humidity. So there's been a large increase in technology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would echo that too, especially when you start talking about corn. Then definitely there's going to be an increase in dryers. I guess in some of the presentations that we've done at PAMI and dealing with producers, the number of producers that have dedicated drying systems, I would say, is dramatically increased, especially when you get out to the west, because of the number of poor harvest seasons we've had in a number of years in a row. So that combination of risk and realizing maybe having options is something that has definitely impacted how you go making that decision about whether it's worth investing in a dedicated drying system.
Mm-hmm. And we've certainly, with Real Agriculture here, we've done some of those discussions of, what is the economic discussion that happens to decide, to actually invest, because these are, pretty expensive setups and those
That's
sorts
right.
of things. But realistically, if you are in a trend of 3, 4, 5, tough harvests in a row, they can more than pay for themselves. Absolutely. And we have Joey here commenting that we dry corn down to 13.5 and beans at 12.5 and freeze. We just try and get rid of our bins before July, but corn, we just core the bins in the spring and we'll keep it all season. And so I'm from out west, but living now in Ontario, and certainly, here it's not so much that individuals have dryers, but I mean, every delivery point has a major dryer, and it does smell kind of delicious. I'll be honest, when it's running. But I mean, that is just a fact of life here, because of course, corn harvest and even soybean harvest just happens so late. So it is sort of a fact of life. And we do actually have a clip of that, which I am going to get to next, which I'm very proud of myself when I get to all 3 clips. So I'm giving myself a pat on the back. But Kara has a question here, and I feel like she's leading here a bit. Shawn, what's the coolest storage drying technology you've seen in your travels? So where have you traveled that you've gone to see cool grain drying?
Oh boy, that's I've traveled quite a bit, but I don't know if I've seen anything much cooler than here in Western Canada.
Hey, look at that.
I don't know. It feels like the last
Yeah.
year I have no memory of being anywhere else except my house. So I
Well,
don't.
yeah, that actually is probably accurate.
Yeah,
So you're close
like
dryer then. Yeah.
yeah. Sorry, I can't come with anything exotic, but just the technology increases I've seen over just through the last couple of tough years. Just the amount, even supplemental heaters with the technology increase now, everything automated. That's I'd say that's there's some cool stuff right here in Western Canada.
Mm-hmm. And Lorne, now you did say you've been at this almost 20 years. So what has been one of the biggest changes for you in dealing with some of this technology?
Well, I just echo a little bit what Shawn is saying. In Western Canada, the technology that's coming into the grain drying and storage area, the automation that goes with it, before we were talking about just leaving your fans on when I was in school, and there was a lot more hair at the top of my head when I was in school. That the rule of thumb was you just turn your fan on, leave it. But that's changed now with the automation and controls, partly too because of the economics that goes with it as well, where electricity has gotten more expensive. You have to factor in those kinds of considerations when you look at the overall grain drying equation. And the ability to automate, to me, is one of those things that just takes some of the guesswork and answers some of these questions that producers typically have in the area. It can really make it a lot easier to manage that grain drying and storage come fall time. Lots of larger grain storages too. You start looking at what's changed here. The size of bins, that's the one thing when you go past yard sites, the bins are big and there's lots of them. And that's definitely a change from what has occurred in the past. So, and then new technologies that go with it for monitoring too, like the grain viz system. That's quite a remarkable novel system for managing and being able to visualize the moisture in 3 dimensions in the bins. So yeah, that's some really interesting technologies out there that can make a difference in terms of how you both monitor it, but also how you market your grain too at the same time.
I still can't get over the size of some of the bins out west, and the ones that have like the staircase that goes around them. Like there's some sort of, like it blows my mind. And I mean, and I was used to seeing them, but it's funny because we're of similar vintage, I think, Lorne. And certainly when I was in university, it was turn your fans on and leave them on.
That's what it was. Yeah. It was easy.
That's what it was.
Turn your fan
It was
on.
simple.
Yeah.
It worked. Okay, I'm not saying it did actually. It didn't necessarily work,
But
but
when
it was easy.
4,000 bushels, it's
Yeah.
It starts to change when you have 20,000 and so on. So
Yes,
the
and north
conversation
from there.
changes.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we only have 10 minutes left, and I promised both of you that this would go quickly. So I hope you feel it's gone as fast as it has for me, as always. But the last clip I am going to bring in, this is my token Ontario clip. So this is about drying corn. This is about grain dryers. So we did mention them somewhat. So we will have a little chat about them. But Jay, if we could have the clip, this is with James Dick with Omafra and Burn Tobin.
So, yeah, one of the things this year, Bernard, is obviously there was a lot of corn that was planted later this spring than guys otherwise would have wanted. The challenge then is trying to get it to market, trying to get it to maturity before you harvest it on time and fully mature. The risk is if maybe you had a little bit of frost before it was fully mature, you could be taking a yield hit. You could see some corn that's a little bit lower quality, especially lower test weight, and that will impact the grade that you get and the price you get on delivery, especially if you're delivering it straight to an elevator, you don't have your own storage capacity, so that can be an issue.
Yeah. So let's talk about drying. I mean, and hitting that quality and managing that test weight. It really starts with, I guess, slow drying, right?
That's right. So when it comes to drying, as I said, if you take it to the elevator, you get what you get. If you have your own capability of drying it, actually the speed you dry it at is pretty important. And there's been some studies, some work that's shown that actually you dry it slower, you dry it at a lower temperature, you can actually increase your test weight. Now the reason for that is, quick physics lesson, the dry matter in your corn kernel is actually a little more dense than the water. So you evaporate some water, you make that kernel a little more dense. You dry it slower, you actually, the density increases a little bit more. Just gives that moisture more time to migrate out. You dry it too quickly, the moisture can't migrate quick enough, it actually causes the kernel to swell, your test weight can go down.
Yeah. Talk about temperature, James. How important is it, to actually not to be too hot, but dry that at the right temperature?
So temperature and speed of drying go hand in hand. Obviously, the lower your temperature, the slower it'll dry, the hotter, the faster. And some work done in the 70s actually showed there was a pretty substantial difference between drying corn at a high temperature like 180, 220 degrees Fahrenheit versus a low temperature like 70, 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Made a difference of up to a couple of pounds per bushel in terms of the final test weight. So that's enough to move it a grade level, or even maybe 2 grade levels. If you're starting with really low quality corn, that can be a big factor. It might be a chance to get some low quality stuff a grade or 2 higher, so that when you actually take it to the market, you get a better price.
Yeah. Any tips for growers on how to move it through the dryer, and make sure you get a better shot at that quality and that grade?
So what I can recommend is if you're thinking about trying to tweak your own dryer temperature to sort of optimize it, start with what you would consider a normal drying temperature. That's going to depend on your type of dryer, whether it's continuous flow, batch, what have you. Let the dryer come to equalize, measure your test weight going in, then let the dryer equalize and measure the test weight of the dry corn coming out. Have a look at those two numbers. Are they different? Was there a change? If you notice that the test weight increased, then try dropping your dryer temperature about 10 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius. Let the dryer stabilize again, measure the test weight again. If it's increased again, then drop it another 10 degrees and keep repeating that cycle until you see the test weight level out. Then you know you've hit sort of an optimal range. You can probably bump your temperature up a few degrees at that point just to make it go a little faster, but once you do that, you can really optimize the temperature and get your dryer, it'll drying a little slower, but your quality is going to be as good as you can get it.
So no cat in that one, but we did have a employee sneaking around the back, which always makes me happy. Okay, so what I love about that clip, for one thing, is people standing next to each other back in the good old days. But also, I found it really interesting that, of course, setting a dryer is going to be far more complicated than just supplemental heat, but still a lot of the same principles apply. And like you mentioned, Lorne, we have to be thinking about quality, not just getting this grain conditioned.
That's right, and that's one of the things to start with, again, is looking at your temperature, because that affects both how quickly it dries, but also the impact on grain, the grain quality itself, and the shrinkage that goes with it. So you want to maximize that the revenue at the end, and that's a combination of making sure you got to get to that sweet spot and doing that in incremental steps. So you're not just trying to do it all at once, but finding that right combination of temperature to get that dry grain, but also the maximum value you can by monitoring and adjusting your dryer for those kinds of operating conditions.
Absolutely. And Shawn, as you mentioned, of course, with supplemental heat, I mean, these systems have come a long way that you can dial them in far more predictably than when we first started out adding heat to fans.
Yes, as I mentioned, you can monitor, both the moisture or the humidity coming in or your temperature, and set it accordingly throughout the day. I think we talked about the air's capacity to hold moisture. So one thing in supplemental heat you'll find is you get later in the season, you get that hot air and cold nights, you can get a lot of condensation on the roof, the cold roof, and raining back down to the bin. So you really need to watch that temperature on times like that. Otherwise, you'll start to have spoilage along the edge of the bin. So it's important. There's a lot of dynamics going on, and making sure you keep a watchful eye on that.
How terrible does cooked canola smell? Like burnt canola? I imagine it's terrible. Yeah. I imagine it is. I don't know. I don't have a ranking of like the worst ones. Although that is one thing. I have two things I want to end with here tonight. One of which is the fun one, so we'll start there. Least favorite crop to work with in a bin setting. Shawn, I'll start with you. Of course, you can't say canola because it's your job.
No,
so you have to pick something else. On your farm, what's your least favorite to deal with in a bin?
Oh, probably oats for itchiness, I guess, would be my shoveling oats is bad.
Yeah, it's not fun. All right, Lorne, how about you? Which crop do you not love working with?
Double down with that on the oats. If you're itchy, it's just itchier with oats.
I thought barley would be worse. Also, Joey says, when I made a comment about burning canola, he says it smells expensive. Yes.
Yeah, that is true. But it never happens, so I don't know what it smells like, right?
Yeah, well, right. No, and unfortunately, it's not a good smell. And yes, right now would smell very expensive. So one of the things I did want to end with, because of course we are talking grain storage, and I would be remiss to not mention, of course, for everyone to be safe around bins, of course, in moving grain, in working in bins and working around bins. We 100% need to make sure that we have safety top of mind. Entrapment happens incredibly quickly. And of course, we're dealing with augers and trucks moving and all those sorts of things that I did want to make sure that everyone is thinking about safety, of course, when we're working in and around bins, for sure. We want everybody to have a safe harvest and get through this one and many more after that. So I did want to make sure that we've got a plug in that, just as a reminder to everybody. And as a reminder, of course, we're back with the Agronomist next week. I don't have a topic yet, so if either of you want to, stick around after the show and let me know what we should be covering next, that would be great. But I did want to say thanks, of course. So Shawn Senko with the Canola Council out of Saskatoon, and Lorne Grieger. I got it right. With
right,
PAMI
yeah.
at a Portage Prairie. Wait, we've got one last question before we go. Jason wants to know, is there a different way to dry oilseed crops like oil sunflowers versus other crops? Do either of you have any experience? Because of course, canola being an oilseed, I know we do have to worry, it is an oilseed, so we treat it a little bit differently than our cereals. But do we treat sunflowers like that too? Do either of you know?
Haven't have a lot of experience on the sunflower side. NDSU's got the most information, I would say, in terms of sunflowers and drying would be the place to look for that. Dr. Kenneth Elving would be the place I would check it.
Yes, and I think we've even had him on the site once or twice. Shawn, do you grow sunflowers? I'm gonna guess no, unless you have like an Instagram patch at the farm.
No, I don't. I don't see many around my travels in here in Saskatchewan.
No, there aren't many. So there you go, Jason. Head on over to NDSU. All right, Lorne, Shawn, thank you so much for your expertise and for your time tonight. I really appreciate it. And to everybody in the comments and for joining us, thank you so much. And everyone be safe and have a wonderful and safe harvest. Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.
Thanks.